Hello, learners. My name is Mr. Adesanmi. Today, we'll be continuing our topic on public finance. Now, under public finance, we've looked at the topic taxation. So today, we'll be looking at incident of taxation. So impact and incident of tax is what we'll be looking at today. So I want you to pay attention to this topic, and I don't want you to miss any of the key points there. So quickly, some of the words we'll be using is incident of tax, impact of tax, and of tax. Now, incident of tax, as you add in the first introduction, is the final resting place of tax. Is the final resting place of tax. While impact of tax is who the tax affects. Who the tax affects, meaning who has the legal responsibility to pay the tax. So in some cases, such responsibility can be shifted. In some cases, such responsibility can be shifted. So we'll be looking at how these three words relate to one. So let's look at let's look at this quickly. So as I said earlier, the impact of tax is who has ability to pay the tax. Now, when we talk about direct tax, we know that the individuals and the company have the legal responsibility to pay the tax. So the impact of tax affects them. While for indirect tax, it is levied on goods and services. So the incidence of such tax for your indirect tax, for your direct tax now, rests on the burden of the tax rests on the individual and the company paying the tax. This cannot be shifted. The burden of such tax cannot be shifted. While for your indirect tax, yes, the burden of the tax or the incidence of the tax can be shifted. So now this is just a brief summary of what we'll be looking at in today's topic. So quickly, what is incident of tax? That's the question. What is incident of tax? Now, tax, as you all know, is like a burden to the payer, because if you are receiving income and tax is removed, it reduces your disposable income. And once your disposable income is reduced, definitely it affects your purchasing power. So tax is like a burden, which naturally people will want to avoid tax or evade tax. People will want to avoid tax or evade tax. So what is incident of tax? Incident of tax refers to the burden of tax with reference to where this burden rests. So when we talk about incident of tax, we're talking about the burden of tax, the final resting place of this tax, meaning who pays this tax. So incident or burden of tax lies on the person who finally pays the tax. So anywhere you hear the word incident of tax, is the burden of tax, where the burden of tax finally rests. So for the purpose of explanation, we're looking at the two types of tax incidents: the formal incident and the effective incident. The formal incident and the effective incident of tax. So let's look at the first one, the formal incident of tax. This refers to the initial effect of tax on the object. So formal is talking about the initial, meaning where does the burden of the tax lie first. Now, for the direct tax, the initial burden of tax rests on the payer. The initial burden of tax rests on the payer. While for indirect tax, the initial burden of the tax rests on the producer, the middleman, Sometimes they both share it, and sometimes either the producer will bear the burden, or the middleman will bear the burden of the initial tax. And later on, it can be transferred wholly or partly to the final consumer. So let's look at direct tax, how this works on direct tax. So for direct tax, the payer bear the full burden of taxation. So for direct tax, it bears both the formal and the effective incident of tax. Meaning the former is the initial resting place, which rests on him as the payer. And this tax cannot be transferred. So formal and effective rest on the payer. So a good example is this: a person who pays income tax bears the full burden of such tax. Why? Because his income cannot be transferred to another person. Therefore, his tax cannot be transferred. So it bears the full burden of such tax. So every of the direct tax has this pattern. Once you are taxed, either your property tax or your capital gain tax, you can't transfer the burden to another person. You are the one to pay such tax. So the formal and effective incident of tax rests on that person. So he will feel the impact of such tax. He can't shift the burden to another person. So that will take us to effective incident. As I've said earlier, it refers to who bears the ultimate or final resting place of that tax, who bear the final burden of such tax. Now, this effective affects your indirect tax. Your indirect tax. We've looked at that of direct tax now. I told you that both the formal and the effective rest on the payer of such tax. And a good example is your income tax, your property tax, and your capital gain tax. But for your effective incident of tax, it's applied to indirect tax. So in the case of indirect tax, the burden of the taxation must be borne by the producer, meaning the seller now, or the consumer. And in some cases, they can share the burden. But the extent to which the producer or the consumer will bear the burden of indirect tax will depend on the elasticity of demand of such product. So the amount of burden each party will carry will depend on how elastic the product is. It depends on how elastic the product is. So before we go into the diagram aspect of it, quickly let's look at this summary, just to have an idea of what we are talking about. So we have about three headings there. We have the basic direct tax and we have the indirect tax. So meaning, a quick revision now. Direct tax refers to the tax that are imposed on properties and income of individuals and companies and are paid directly by them to the government. So there's no middleman. In some cases, before the salaries of that individuals get to their hand, tax has been removed. I'll repeat that again. In some cases, before the salaries of those individuals working in big companies like Cadbury, like Nestle, and name them, tax has been removed. So they pay directly to the government. While for indirect tax, it refers to those tax which affect the income and properties of individuals and companies through their consumption expenditure. So these affect them indirectly through what they buy, buying of raw materials for the company, as individual buying food items that you're going to eat. So indirectly, you are paying such tax. Even some of us don't even know we're paying such tax. So let's look at the impact. So direct tax are levied on individuals and companies. So for direct tax, individual and companies pay such tax. While for your indirect tax, it is levied on goods and services. A good example of such is your value-added tax. We have your sales tax. We have your purchase tax. We have your import duty, your export duties, and name them. So sometimes you pay this tax without even knowing you are paying the tax. So shift of burden. Yes, for direct tax, the burden of such tax, the weight of such tax, the impact of such tax cannot be shifted. So the impact and incidence of such tax is paid or bared by the person paying it. So you can't shift the burden. While for your indirect tax, the burden of indirect tax can be shifted, meaning the impact and the incidence of such tax can be shifted to another person, meaning the producer can shift it to the consumer, or the consumer can shift it to the producer, or both of them can share the burden of such tax. So nature, for your direct tax, it is progressive in nature, while for your indirect tax, it is proportional in nature. Remember that progressive is pay as you earn, while proportional is a flat rate. So just like your sales tax is flat, your VAT is flat rate. So coverage. Now your direct tax has a limited range as they do not reach all the sections of the country. Yes, for your direct tax, it's not everybody that is affected because some can avoid paying it. Yes, some can avoid paying it. We have people that have been working for a lot of years, especially in developing nations of the world where the collective system is collection of the system to collect tax has not been improved yet. So people can evade tax, people can avoid tax. So the coverage is not when we compare to indirect tax. Indirect tax has a wider coverage because so far you are buying an item, you are paying tax. So far you are consuming an item, you are paying tax, even without you knowing you are paying tax. So far you are buying raw materials to produce goods and services, you are paying tax, even without knowing. So it has a wider coverage than your direct tax. So this knowledge will help you in the next section that we are going. So we'll be looking at the graphical illustration of incidence of tax. So we will now be introducing graphs to what we've been discussing since now. But this graph will affect mainly indirect tax. Why? Because we want to see the final resting place of this tax based on how elastic the product is, based on the price elasticity of demand of such products. For your direct tax, we're not really concerned about that because we know who pays the tax. It is either the individual or the company, depending now. Either is property tax, capital gain tax, or income tax. So the person bears the burden of such tax. But for your indirect tax, we don't really know who bears the burden. We don't really know the final resting place of such tax without knowing how elastic the product is. So we have about 5 price elasticity of demand, as you can see. So we have the perfectly elastic, we have the perfectly inelastic, we have elastic, we have inelastic, and we have unitary. So the incidence of indirect tax depends on the price elasticity of the product in question. So for a quick overview, let's look at this first diagram. So this first diagram, we have 2 diagrams there. We have 2 diagrams there. And the first you see is your indirect tax. Your indirect tax. Now the second, inelastic demand, while the second is your elastic demand. The first again is your inelastic demand, while the second is your elastic demand. Now take note of the price section there, the price axis, and the quantity axis there. Take note of that. Take note of those 2. So we have here, sorry, I want you to use the pen. Sorry about that, so that it will be very clear. We have the elastic demand there and the inelastic demand there, yes. And then here as well, we have the quantity section. Here we have the price section. Now take note, we have here as the first equilibrium point. That's the first equilibrium point there. where your P meets your Q. The first question is this: how do we know this is inelastic demand? Now look at the gap between your P1 and P, and then Q1 and Q. You'll see that the gap between your P1 and P is larger than that of your Q1 and Q. So it shows that if the price increase by, let's say, 70%, the quantity demanded responds a little by, let's say, about 10%. So it shows that the commodity in question is inelastic. So take note of that. That's how you recognize an inelastic demand. The slope of the demand curve tells you if it's elastic or inelastic. So a change in price will lead to little or no change in quantity demanded. That shows that the commodity in question is inelastic. So the slope of the demand shows that. Now the first point, as I've said initially, is here, which shows the first equilibrium point of S. Now, as a result of introduction of tax, that tax now will affect the production costs of the firm, because the initial resting place, as I've told you, the former resting place of your indirect tax is on the producer or the middlemen. So they are the one that will fill the initial resting place of the tax. So in some cases, they pay the tax before transferring the tax to the consumers. So the initial resting place of the tax or the former resting place of the tax rests on the producer. So because it rests on the producer, it affects their production cost. So if their production cost is high, then the supply of their commodity will be low. The supply will be lower. And that's why you see the tax shifting to the left. So it's shifting from S to ST, meaning tax has been included. Now, as your supply shifts up and your demand remains the same, definitely the price of that commodity will go up. And that's why you see the price moving from P to P1. P to P1. So that shows that price has increased from P to P1. Now, the gap between your P1 and P is what the consumer is going to pay, meaning the tax burden on the consumer. Why, if you trace the new equilibrium point now, which is this one, if you trace that to meet the first supply curve, which is S, we'll get another point under P, which is in red. Under P, sorry about that, under P, which is in red, yes, that point there, which is in red, shows the second burden of such tax, because the product is inelastic does not mean that the consumer will bear all the burden. So some of the burden will be transferred to the supplier or to the producer, unlike if the product is perfectly inelastic. So the supplier will bear some of the burden, but the consumer here bears a larger percentage of the burden. Why? Because the commodity in question is inelastic. It does not have close substitute. So the supplier or the producer can conveniently transfer the tax burden. Remember, I said E is at the receiving end first, the former resting place. So the effective resting place of the tax now rests on the buyer more. About 90% of such tax rests on the buyer, which will show in form of high price, while a lower percentage rests on the supplier or the producer, which affects his profit, Now, the second one we'll be looking at is this, which is your elastic demand. Now, elastic in nature. Why? Because the gap between your P and your P1 is different from the gap between your Q1 and Q. You can see, unlike inelastic demand, for your elastic demand, the gap between your P and P1 is smaller compared to the gap between your Q1 and Q. So it shows that a little change in price will lead to a greater change in quantity demanded, unlike your inelastic, which shows that a greater change in price leads to little or no change in quantity demanded. But for your elastic demand, shows a little increase in price lead to a greater decrease in quantity demanded. So, and that's why you see the gap, and that's why your demand curve slopes down, unlike your inelastic demand. So, taking note of that as well, the former equilibrium point is where P and Q meet, which is this place. That's the first equilibrium point. But as a result of introduction of tax, then the curve shifts up. The curve shifts up from S to ST, from S to ST. So that will give us a new price, which is PT. So from P to PT is the burden that the buyer will carry. Now, if you trace the second equilibrium point now, the price deck, trace it down, yes, to the first S, you see that there's a place where they meet. Yes, that place where they meet, this place where they meet is the burden of the supplier, because as I've said, the buyer cannot bear the burden alone. So how do you calculate this burden? Now, if you look at the gap between your S and your S1, this one, the gap between your S and your S1 must be the same as the gap between your P and your P1. In this case, it's not the same. So it shows that the burden will be shared, because the buyer cannot carry the burden alone. So the burden will be shared, and that is why see that from P downwards, yes, from P downwards to the point where you have the red line, yes, that is the total burden of the tax. So the two of them are sharing it. So from PT to P1 is carried by the buyer, while from P down to this point is carried by the producer. So you notice that the producer is carrying, or the supplier now is carrying, more burden than the buyer. Why? Because the product in question is elastic. So this commodity has close substitute. So if the price is too high, the consumer will just leave the commodity and go for another commodity. And that is why if government is taxing products that have elastic demand, they are very careful not to overtax them, because this can close a firm down if government tax them too much. Remember that they can't transfer the burden to the final consumer. So they just transfer part of it, and they also keep a larger percentage of it. They pay on their behalf because of the nature of the product in question. So the same thing applies here. For tax with elastic demand. Just as I've explained, tax with elastic demand. Now you notice this, that we have your S1, which is the first equilibrium point, where 14 meets 80. 13 meets 80. 13 meets 80. So that point is the point of equilibrium. That point is the point of equilibrium. So take note of that. Our point of equilibrium is here. I'm just trying to bring my pen out so that I'll be able to show you that. So our point of equilibrium is here. That's the first point of equilibrium. So as a result of introduction of tax, there's a shift in the curve from S1 to S2. From S1 to S2. So this will now give us another equilibrium point here, which is the new equilibrium point. So because of that, look at it, the gap between S1 and S2 should be the same thing as the gap between the price. That's why you have that there. So it shows that if the price is moving from 13 to 14, so a small percentage of the tax introduced was carried by the consumer. Okay, why the larger portion made by the producer. Take note of that. Look at the gap between your S1 and S2. should be equal to the gap between your new price and your old price here. So if 13 is the old price and 14 is the new price, so the gap is small, definitely the burden of the other part of the burden of the tax will be carried by the producer. So how do you know that? Just link the new equilibrium point down to the first supply curve, the new equilibrium point, which is your S, where your demand meets S2, link that equilibrium point to the first supply curve and then link it back. You will get the other burden of the tax which the producer is going to carry, and in this case is 8. So meaning though the price is 13, the producer will be carrying 13 minus 8. So the producer's profit now will be this, down, this, down. That's the producer's burden. So meaning his profit is affected already. And he's supposed to be selling at 13, but though he's selling at 14, he's giving government that. So he's taking at price 8. So indirectly, it has affected his profit. So and why is he doing that? As I've explained in the last class, and also in the last diagram I showed you, is elastic in nature, and because it's elastic in nature, it does not have any choice but to bear most of the burden of this tax and transfer the order to the consumers. So that will take us to tax with inelastic demand. These I've also explained. So these are more diagrams on that. Inelastic shows that a little change in price will lead to little or no change in quantity demanded. So you can see for yourself, looking at the second diagram, which is this one. So the same explanation as I explained in the first one also apply to this. Now, if it's unitary, it shows that they will both share the burden of the tax, 50-50. The incidence shared evenly between the supplier and the producer because the demand is unitary in nature. So even when tax is introduced, the producer both bear the burden, and the producer and the consumer, and they both share the burden together. Now, the one that is more interesting is your perfectly elastic demand. Now, take note of how your elastic demand is. It's just a straight line. So, and at that price of $1.50, the producer can sell at any quantity. It can sell at 90, it can sell at 100, it can sell at 200. But if the price increase just a little, the consumers will not buy. They will just begin, the demand for that product will begin to drop until he has no more people to supply such a commodity. So in this case, if the commodity in question is perfectly elastic, it is the producer that bears the burden completely. He can't transfer the burden to the consumer. I'll say that again. He can't transfer the burden to the consumer. It is the producer that bears the burden fully, because any attempt to increase the price of such commodity, the consumers will not buy that commodity again. So as you can see, that it is the producer that bears the burden of such tax. You can see there, the producer bears the burden of such tax. So it can, and that affects him how? Because the quantity that he's going to supply now will now reduce from 100 to 90. So we have the new equilibrium point here. He's giving government the difference between this and this. That's what he's giving the government, difference between this and this. So his profit is just this, from here, there. That's his profit. Okay, and it's giving government this area of the burden that is carrying. So it can't transfer the burden to the consumer. Why? Because the commodity in question is perfectly elastic. So the consumer can get a substitute, a perfect substitute for that commodity. So the producer cannot take that risk of saying he's transferring the burden to part of the burden to the consumer. It will be at the losing end. So, and that is why in this diagram, the producer is the one carrying all the burden of such tax. So the next is when the tax is perfectly inelastic. Perfectly inelastic. So when the product is perfectly inelastic, it shows that the commodity in question does not have a close substitute. A good example of such is your salt, blood, and in this case we use insulin. So it said in the market for insulin, the demand is perfectly inelastic. With no tax, the price is $2 a dose, and the quantity sold is 100 doses a day. So a tax of 20 cents was introduced. So, and that shifted the supply curve. That shifted the supply curve upward. You can see that. So the supply curve is shifted from S to S plus tax. So now we have a new price from 2 to 0.20, meaning from $2 to $2.02 because a tax of 20 cents. That might be a sales tax, flat tax was introduced. So that curve shifted from S to S plus tax. So the price has risen up. So in this case, because insulin has no close substitute, the producer can conveniently shift the burden of such tax on the final consumer. So it does not even need to share anything. So that's why you see the whole burden of this tax is carried by the consumer. The whole burden of this tax is carried by the producer. I will repeat that again. The whole burden of such tax is carried by the consumer. By the consumer. So it's the consumer that is carrying the burden. Unlike this one, when the product is perfectly elastic, it is the producer that is carrying the burden. While when it is perfectly inelastic, it is the consumer or the buyer that is carrying all the burden. So take note of this. These are tax that you can these are diagrams that you can use in the exam. Now, if the commodity in question is ad valorem, meaning if the tax system you want to use is ad valorem tax, so that's how the diagram will look like. So take note of that. So now there are a lot of lovely diagrams under your incident of tax, which as a student you should know. But at least for a beginner and for the purpose of this class, these 5 diagrams are very important for you to know. So you can go over through the video again and listen again, and then you do your personal study, and by so doing you'll be able to have more understanding on this tax. So far you have a good understanding of your price elasticity of demand. That will help you in a long way to understand how the shifting of your supply curve from S to S1 or S plus tax, how the shifting will affect your price. So if you have a good understanding of your price elasticity of demand, it will go a long way in helping you. So that's the end of this video for today. Very much.